Okay, so of course, the most important figure in, I'd say like female figure in the Christian tradition would be Mary. I'm going to refrain from making a Jewish mother joke.
Oh, come on.
As an almost Jewish mother myself.
Right.
But I'd be interested to hear what you like to, how you like to think about the Mary stories in the New Testament.
Yeah, so one thing I always like to bring up when I talk about Mary is something called the Bechdel test. Have you heard of that?
Oh, I think, does this have to do with like how many characters are like speaking roles that
are women? Yeah, so it's named after Alison Bechdel, who wrote this comic strip called Dykes to Watch Out For. And it is a test for movies initially, or shows, or anything really, a work.
I'm totally going to use this in my classes now.
In which at least two women talk to each other. Sometimes one of the requirements is that they're named, and they talk to each other about something other than men.
I'm like, as you're going through the list, I'm like,
yes, exactly. So how many, and people, one person has actually blogged about this, I don't remember, we could post this later, of how many times this happens in the Hebrew Bible, how many times this has happened in the New Testament. Now, there is one spot in the end of the Synoptics, or actually in Mark, in which the women are named. They go to the tomb after Jesus has been buried, and they're discussing with each other what they're going to do when they get there. So that's one. The only other occurrence of this in which women talk to each other and are named is with Mary and Elizabeth. And this is in Luke, when we have the birth narratives of John the Baptist and of Jesus. And so I find that as a very interesting and valuable, very precious part of the entire New Testament, because there's only one other occurrence, and it's much larger, of course, than the occurrence in Mark. So I think of Mary as this figure that becomes huge in tradition, but this is also a snippet within Luke in which we see females talking to each other, and the types of females that there are also really telling. So we have Elizabeth, and we'll talk about barrenness in another episode, I guess we're calling it. But she's older, an older woman who hasn't had a child, right? Vulnerable in the judgment of others, and in deciding whether she's favored because she has borne no children.
I see a lot of echoes from the Hebrew Bible.
Exactly, and this is exactly what Luke intends, right? The author of Luke intends to have that biblical overtone of the entire story, right? So that Jesus fits right in.
So is that like the Magnificat, right?
Yes, so Mary, another vulnerable person, right? One of the most vulnerable, she's described as a virgin. So she's a Parthenos, she is of marriageable age, but a girl and going to be married. And she becomes pregnant. And the story is very similar to other miraculous conception stories, right, in the Hebrew Bible, because you have an appearance of a messenger, there's some confusion, an announcement, and then she becomes pregnant. So another vulnerable person, but when the two of them meet, it's like this powerful, like, oracular moment, because John the Baptist within Elizabeth jumps in utero, because he recognizes who's coming, because Mary herself pregnant arrives. So you have two pregnant women who are talking to each other, and it's this moment of kind of a reversal of power, where Mary gives this the Magnificat, which is an echo of Hannah's song. So it's, he will overthrow those who are on high and bring them down, and the lowly will rise up. So it's echoed also, it's demonstrated, the whole prophecy, by the raising up of these women to be part of the narrative, to have that talk. So
it's so interesting because it's also two women. I mean, it's not just this like test of like how many women are having conversations with each other. Like,
right.
Sort of like, does the audience care about what women think, right? But it's also a sort of reversal of how power sort of makes itself known in sort of the broader ancient Near Eastern biblical literary tradition of like how prophecy works, a sort of like, transmission of speech like instruction from someone who's hierarchically above to someone who is beneath.
Yes. And
you have instead. So what is the relationship between Mary and Elizabeth?
So They're relatives to each other. And so Mary goes to visit Elizabeth. And it's interesting that Elizabeth is the older woman who sees Mary, and then John the Baptist jumps with excitement inside of her, and she receives her and blesses her and calls her blessed, right? And Mary's blessed in different ways in that whole entire birth and infancy narrative of Jesus. And so it's kind of a mutual affirmation, right? And so Elizabeth meets her and blesses her, calls her blessed, and then Mary greets her as well and then gives the Magnificat. So it's this moment of like, they're both so incredibly significant for the story that's going to follow. And we have a moment of power, I think, in which we have the divine speaking through Mary. And then they kind of don't figure into the text after a certain point, right? After Jesus is around 12 years old and he teaches in the temple, and we hear Mary's perspective obliquely on all of this, then she has a very nominal role in the rest of the story. But those first chapters are so incredibly important and interesting that they draw out these two women.
I guess I do kind of wonder if it's more plot device than sort of a continuation. I like to think of characterization in sort of the biblical literary tradition as the continuation or like the heritage of Israel's heroes, right? Where like women need not be included. I'm thinking in particular of Ben Sira, right, with like Israel's heroes, like where are the women?
Yeah.
Like Ben Sira is also like incredibly misogynistic text.
So if you want to look at it cynically, I think you could say, I think you have those chapters and you have kind of a glimpse of an inner life when Mary kept this all in her heart when she sees all of these things happening. So I think that is also a literary device to clue the reader in, right? There's something that's going to happen. There's a type of secrecy that's going to be revealed, but Mary knows something's up, right, with this child, and something's going to happen.
Yeah. It's interesting that there's like there's sort of like a rich interior world to the characters, but also there's like a literally an interior world to the characters, right? Because you have
in utero.
Exactly. Right. So I wonder if this is part of the way in which the story is playing with interior life.
Yeah. And what's interesting in terms of thinking about plot device, yes, I think Mary and the fact that she is a virgin are necessary in establishing Jesus as a character. Because here we're talking about, of course, a son of God, right? And so how are we going to understand that? And it's taken very literally, right? The power on high will come over you, right? And you will become pregnant. And so this is the Annunciation. We must know that he does not have an earthly father. He is divine. This is a divine son. And this has political overtones in thinking about the Greco-Roman world and the announcement of good news through Caesar Augustus, who brings the Pax Romana, or he is called a son of God, right? And so are other subsequent emperors. And so we're establishing that this is the case, absolutely. And Luke also does this through his genealogy, in which he traces Jesus all the way back beyond the patriarchs to Adam, and then as a son of God. So we can have no question about that. But then her use rhetorically in that sense kind of drops away as he becomes, the full man in ministry and wandering out of Galilee and headed towards crucifixion. So she doesn't figure as largely in the rest of the story. She's there. She's mentioned as being present in different areas at the crucifixion and then also at the tomb. But then her importance for establishing lineage is dropping out.
I mean, not to be totally cynical, but it does still seem to me that these characters, these women characters, with the sort of like all the richness of how the story unfolds, is also kind of like a placeholder. There's like both Mary and Elizabeth as placeholders for what's really to come, right? Or the figures that are really to be that come from them. And it actually even strangely makes me think of sort of ancient Mesopotamian childbirth practices in which once the child is born, the child actually doesn't become a person until that cord is cut and until the stump of the cord falls off. And so this is sort of it's a little like they did delayed cord clamping then too. It is kind of interesting that there's this idea of how like a person becomes when they And this is also like Genesis in the, in the second creation story in the garden, like how a person leaves their parents and becomes
a person.
A person.
So what's fascinating is to think about this on a medical viewpoint. So there have been debates in the reception history of this virgin birth of how much of Jesus is Mary, right? So we have the divine who is conceived in Mary, right, has inseminated her somehow, and she gives birth. So then this goes into the medical, like, does Mary provide the matter in that the Logos sperm seed is going to then work with to create? So like,
how much is Mary and
how much of Mary, right, is being used in this? So that's one fascinating debate that happens in different church fathers talking about the virgin birth and how do we understand that medically. And then of course that feeds into also who Jesus is. But again, Mary as a placeholder for something unique, but she in herself is part of a function, right, for that particular story. Of course, she has a rich tradition all her own following her, but within the narrative of the Gospels and the Synoptic Gospels, that I think that would be one cynical interpretation of her importance. In John, when Jesus is dying, she turns to Mary from the cross and talks to the beloved disciple, and to the both of them, she says, "Woman, here is your son, and here is your mother." And it's almost as if he is then leaving that lineage of the human lineage, right? And she has now a replacement son, right? Or someone, in one way, of course, taking care of her, but also, in a sense, changing the family, right? Now he is now going, this is his time, right?
Yeah, which
so
is so
interesting. Yeah,
and just like still part of those like broader themes of sort of ceasing to work within this concept of like the father as the head of the family, and looking to a heavenly father instead of the one who's in charge of the family.
Yeah. But I like it that then she has her entire huge multiple traditions following her.
Yeah.